Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is August 19, 2019, and this is podcast number 35. I am happy to have you back with us one more time to discuss philosophy. In this season, we are talking about the philosophy of education. And our philosopher for this week is John Dewey. We are talking about education from the perspective of this great philosopher, this great thinker in modern philosophy. And we are particularly talking about one of his famous books about education. It is the book John Dewey, Experience in Education. So as the name implies, our topic this week is experience in education. Now, the previous podcast, we talked about the relationship between traditional versus progressive education, in which we sort of pointed out some of the issues that Dewey highlighted in his book. And this week, we're going to center on the notion of experience. And we are going to talk about the degree to which experience is important. And in the end, Dewey argues that, having experience from a traditional perspective is important, but having experience from a progressive lens is also important, because at the end of the day, certain experiences in the individual are important. So we have to take into account the way the individual views the world. We have to take into account a certain aspect of experience, be it traditional or progressive, in order to have a good sense of what education is or what education should be. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Dewey said, if we were to reject notions about traditional education and we were to espouse a much more progressive approach to education, that would not necessarily solve any problem. We would be in denial until we acknowledge that a traditional, at least a modern or a progressive approach to education does not solve the problem of education in and of itself. We also have to recognize the relationship that exists between education and personal experience. We need not to rely so much on the progressive education, that is, an education that is based on empirical and experimental philosophy. And the problem here is that when you have an education that is based on empirical or experimental philosophy, we are sort of relying too much on experience or experiments, which are not necessarily obvious to everyone or self-explanatory, Dewey said. So what he's saying is that the reason is that what is empiricism is not well understood. What is experience is not well understood. Because at the end of the day, experience is not always something common. It's not something that is shared. And certain experiences are not education worthy. In other words, those experiences may not be necessary to educate somebody else about that experience or about certain experiences one had at a certain point in time. So there's not an irrefutable link between experience and education, because certain experiences could engender a reality that might not work for somebody else. Experience could lead to callousness and sensitivity and a lack of responsiveness, Dewey said. When we rely too much on certain experiences, we are also restricting ourselves in terms of what we know, what we have understood, what we have experienced about the world is what the world is. Therefore, we are not open to new experiences, to new realities. So we are bounded within that little paradigm of what we know or what we think we know. So there is no universality in the concept of experience, okay? Because what is experience to you is not necessarily experience to me. So when we have an educational system that is based on this approach to education, this approach to empiricism or experimental philosophy, this education is bound to fail. This education would create more problem than it helps solve. Now, when it comes to traditional education offers certain experiences even within the educational system itself. For instance, within the classroom itself, the student is having certain experiences. The student is going through certain realities which may inform his or her understanding of the world, of the people around him. So that experience in and of itself, while it is important, while it is relevant, it might not be education worthy. It might not be an experience to be used as the foundation of education in and of itself. So when you are looking at the concept of experience in education, the assumption is that traditional education relies so much on certain experiences that are not necessarily transferable, that are not necessarily compatible, that are not necessarily relatable to other learners, right? The assumption here is that progressive education is going to provide other types of experience which could be relatable, which could be accepted, which could be compatible with the others or with others. And Dewey is saying this is not necessarily the case. So the argument that so many progressists have advanced is the notion that, when you rely so much on, certain experiences, from people who viewed the world a certain way, so you sort of lose the child in the process, right? So many kids have sort of lost interest in their education because of the way certain things were taught to them, because the way certain materials were projected to them within the corridors of the traditional educational system, right? So the argument is that we ought to look at least the progressive point of view, is that we need to look at education from a different angle. But Dewey is saying, does progressive education offer something different from what traditional education offered in terms of linking the experience of the learner, or at least in terms of personal realities, and the world itself as the world is, or as the learner should see it? So it's this idea that if you have an educational system that is based on traditional view, it is going to create problems for the learner. Those who advocate a progressive approach to education always refer to the concept of boredom. They say, well, kids are bored in the class because what's being taught to them is not entertaining, is not engaging, is not raising the interest of the learner. So we need to change direction. And there's also this understanding that what students learn inside the classroom has nothing to do with what's happening outside. So there's no way to transfer that knowledge into the real world. So There's also this understanding that when you are forced to learn certain things, forced to read certain books, certain worldviews, it changes your perspective about the whole world, and you'll sort of, pigeonhole yourself into a particular way of life and a particular way of worldview, which is not going to benefit you in the end. Now, Dewey is making it clear that he is not demonizing old education, if you will, traditional education. But he's trying to point that young people, when they come to the classroom, they do have some personal baggages, some personal weight that they carry along with them. So when they come into the classroom, they're not, as it is always understood, a blank slate. They're not, sort of empty inside, that they have to be inculcated a way, that is, they have to be inculcated a certain way of life, okay? They have their own experiences, which should be taken into account, according to John Dewey. So he's saying that the problem is not the absence of experience itself. Rather, it's the way these experiences are considered or understood. So Dewey is saying that experience is important. It is important to the extent that everything has to be based on a certain experience, on a quality of experience, right? So that quality of experience generally has two aspects. There's what Dewey calls an immediate aspect of agreeableness and disagreeableness, and there is the notion of the influence of the disagreeableness, and there is the influence of those past experiences onto recent experiences. So, for instance, if you had, let's say you had a bad experience about a teacher. Let's use that example. That you had a teacher who would come into the class, would teach a certain way, who would yell at students, would punish you for anything willy-nilly. A teacher who would make you do all the work, would teach almost nothing in the classroom. That experience could affect the way that person ended up looking at education as a whole. That experience could affect the way that student learned in the future. It could affect the way this student views the world in terms of how he or she should interact with other people in the world. So Dewey is saying certain experiences are bad, but some of the key components of an experience is the concept of agreeableness and disagreeableness, okay? If the experience were either agreeable or disagreeable, that could in turn affect how the student experiences other situations, other realities. Now, this in turn could create more problems for educators. The effect of certain experiences are not always easy to decipher. Therefore, a person could be acting in a certain way in a classroom, and you don't necessarily know why the person is acting that way. The person could be reluctant to be a certain way, and you don't know why. Many a time, it's because of certain experiences that the person had that were either disagreeable or agreeable, and that in turn shaped the way the individual behaves. Okay, and Dewey is saying we need to take that into account as we are trying to understand the extent to which experience affects the individual, or at least the learner in this case. Now, Dewey recognizes that the novel or the new or the traditional or the progressive approach to education appears much simpler than the traditional schools or the traditional approach to education. But that does not necessarily make such an approach to education, a good one, okay? And he's saying that being simple or being easy is not necessarily identical, okay? So in recent years, this idea of having an educational system that is driven towards student development, towards student learning is a new idea. It is part of the notion of a progressive education. But Dewey is saying that this approach to education is also flawed, for it does not take into account certain aspects. For instance, it doesn't take into account, the experience of the individual to the extent that that experience matters. So when you're talking about progressive education, the understanding is that we could take everything about education and combine it into one approach, one, a linear, if you will, sort of way of looking at education, and then that would apply to everyone. Now, Dewey is not necessarily argue in favor of the traditional education. That's not what he's doing here. But he's showing you that, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, is the incompatibility that is often echoed about traditional education and versus progressive or new education is not necessarily there. It is not necessarily that obvious, because at the end of the day, the new approach to education creates more problem than it solves. Now, many a time you hear this, and in fact, this is the trend in education these days. It's this idea of standards. You have to have common core standards. Students need to learn a certain way. They need to react to the world a certain way. Now, essentially, we're making robots, okay? Now, we are not going to debate, at least not today, the relevance of the degree to which such an approach could be harmful to the individual. But we, at least if you have listened to my previous podcast, you sort of can see where this argument is going, is that the individual has absolutely no control over the self. And it is not necessarily because the individual does not want to have any control. It is because it is the individual has been cut out to be a certain way. And it is through this approach to education where the individuality is sort of removed from the process, okay? When you take a bunch of students and then you put them in a classroom and you start teaching them about the world a certain way, you are asking them to take, at least to remove their personal biases and whatnot in order to focus on what it is that you're teaching them. That does not necessarily solve the problem as to the impact of their personal biases could have in their lives or in the lives of others. It does not necessarily solve that problem. In fact, it creates new problems, right? Because the individual becomes a collective without being an individual. Sometimes it is necessary to have personal biases, personal worldviews about the world, which would inform the learner as to why the world is a certain way. Why John is different from me. Why Jonas is different from me. Why Martin is different from me. Why, Caitlin is different from me, right? So the individual is able to process those differences and, sometimes come to terms with them, right? So the individual could still retain his individuality while it is part of a collective. When the line between the collective and the individual is blurry, then the individual becomes a robot. In other words, the individual is dead inside, because the individual only exists so long as the collective allows him to exist. The individual only exists so long as the collective provides the pedestal for him to exist, because there are certain expectations as to why the individual is, when the individual is, how the individual is, and for what purpose the individual is supposed to be the way that he is. So all of these create more problem than they solve, as far as John Dewey is concerned, because what Dewey is saying, our understanding about education is equally misguided about our misunderstanding about education. So in the next podcast, we are going to continue this discussion. But the bottom line is this: experience is important. But if we are going to have an educational system that is based on experience, which are empirical in nature, experimental in nature, then it is wrong. If we are going to have an educational system that is based on these old views about what experience is or ought to be, in terms of what the individual is or what the individual is supposed to be, then that is equally wrong. So in effect, we need a balance between what the individual is traditionally and what the individual is supposed to be from a progressive lens. And that in and of itself is going to allow us to have a better understanding as to what education is or what education is supposed to be.